Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name's Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled. And today I'm going to be talking about the infamous Abomination of Desolation. That's talked about in Daniel, and also Jesus talked about it in the Olivet Discourse. By the way, before I get started, I just wanted to give a special thanks to the regular listeners of this channel. It's so awesome to hear, all the feedback and the comments you guys are leaving. So I just wanted to say that I really appreciate it. You guys and ladies are awesome. So anyway, thanks for being, regular listeners and for all your comments and feedback and everything. Okay, so with that said, as I said, I'm going to talk about the Abomination of Desolation. When did it happen, and what does it refer to? Okay, so let me start off by reading what Jesus said about the Abomination of Desolation in the book of Matthew. He said, and he said this in the Olivet Discourse, approximately the year AD 33, somewhere around AD 33 or so. Okay, and here's what Jesus said. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. End quote. And this is again from Matthew 24, verses 15 through 16. Okay, so what does the term abomination of desolation refer to? The term abomination of desolation literally means the abomination that causes desolation. And by the way, I got this from Don Preston, his video called The Olivet Discourse, First the Abomination. It's video number 376. Okay, so the term abomination of desolation literally means the abomination that causes desolation. And this term, abomination of desolation, struck terror into the hearts of the first century Jews. It induced thoughts of 2 centuries earlier, when the Greek Hellenistic king Antiochus Epiphanes had defiled the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar. Again, this happened about 200 years prior to Jesus, in approximately the year 168 BC. Okay, so the reason why God allowed this desolation of the temple to happen back then was because of Israel's gross religious failures. So Jesus talking about this meant that Israel was once again guilty of gross religious failure. In fact, Jesus called the Jewish leaders of his day everything from hypocrites, and you can read this in Matthew 23, by the way. So he called the religious leaders, or the scribes and Pharisees, everything from hypocrites to fools to blind guides to whitewashed tombs to murderers to broods of vipers. And Jesus lamented, quote, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate." And he's talking about the temple here. Again, this is Matthew 23, verses 37 to 38. So, in other words, God had already departed this temple. It was desolate. God had already departed it. As with many of the other themes and motifs that are mentioned in the New Testament, such as the last days and the coming of the Lord and the resurrection, the new heaven and earth, kingdom of God, things like that. As with all these other themes and motifs in the New Testament, the abomination of desolation was something that had been prophesied about in the Old Testament. You can read that in Daniel 9, verses 26 to 27, or Daniel 12, verse 11. That's why when Jesus said, when he was talking about the abomination of desolation, he says, as spoken by Daniel. So he was, referring to prophecy back by in the days of Daniel, or back when Daniel prophesied about this. So in other words, it should have not been all that shocking for the Jews in Jesus' day to learn that it was finally happening. Okay, so now let me talk about the timing. We can pinpoint the timing of the abomination in 2 ways. The first is simply by reading the context of Matthew 24. In verse 2, Jesus warns about the destruction of the temple. He says, not one stone will be left upon another. Then in verse 3, and again, I'm in Matthew 24. So in verse 3, the disciples ask when it will happen. They wanted to know when the temple would be destroyed. They said, tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And by the way, the reason why the disciples automatically thought coming of the Lord after Jesus had, mentioned the destruction of the temple is because to a biblically literate Jew, which the disciples, clearly were, such a judgment equated to a coming of the Lord. The Old Testament has many such comings of the Lord, God the Father's comings. You can read about these in Isaiah 13 verses 9 to 11, or Isaiah 19:1, or Micah 1 verses 3 to 4. So these comings of the Lord are, there were many comings of the Lord in the Old Testament. Therefore, when Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple, the disciples automatically thought coming of the Lord, and they wanted to know when it would happen, because such a judgment, that's what it referred to, a coming of the Lord. That's what a coming of the Lord, like a coming on clouds, that's what that refers to, a judgment. And by the way, I'll leave a link to my video called What is a Coming of the Lord in the video notes below. If you're interested, I go over this in detail. Okay, so after Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple, the disciples asked when it would happen. They asked about a coming of the Lord, and they also asked about the end of the age. Now, why the disciples automatically thought end of the age is because the temple symbolized the Old Covenant age. You can read this in Hebrews 9 verses 8 and 9. Without a temple, the Jews could not keep, or they would not be able to keep, a vast majority of the Old Testament or the Old Covenant requirements, such as animal sacrifices or priestly duties or pilgrimages to the temple 3 times a year. In fact, without a temple, only 77 positive and 126 negative commandments can be observed out of 613. So basically only a third of the Old Covenant commandments can be kept without a temple. So in essence, no temple, no Old Covenant. Therefore, when Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple, the disciples automatically thought end of the age, or end of the Old Covenant age, and they wanted to know when it would happen. Okay, so Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple. The disciples ask about the timing. And then Jesus gives the various precursors, such as false messiahs, persecution, great tribulation, and he also talks about the abomination of desolation. Then Jesus said it would all happen within this generation. He says, quote, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things happen. And he said this in verse 34. Again, we're still in Matthew 24. So this is Matthew 24, verse 34. So Jesus said all these things, including the abomination of desolation, would happen within a generation. And a generation equates to about 40 years. You can read this in Hebrews 3, verses 8 through 10, or Numbers 14, verse 30 to 34, or Nehemiah 9, verse 21. So all these events, including the abomination of desolation, must have happened by about the year AD 70 per Jesus. Okay? All right. So that's the first reason we know it must have happened in the first century. The second reason we know that the abomination of desolation happened in the first century is by comparing Matthew's account of the Olivet Discourse to Luke's. Here's what Matthew said again. Therefore, when you see the it's Jesus talking, but it's in the book of Matthew. So anyway, Matthew says, or the book of Matthew says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This is Matthew 24, verses 15 to 16. Okay, now Luke's version says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This is Luke 21, verses 20 to 21. So both accounts begin with when you see, right? However, because Luke was talking to Gentiles who would not have been familiar with the term abomination of desolation, Luke made it easier for his audience to understand Jesus' prophecy by simply saying, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then flee to the mountains. But Matthew, on the other hand, was writing to Jews who would have been intimately familiar with the term abomination of desolation from the book of Daniel. Therefore, Matthew said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, flee to the mountains. Both Matthew and Luke were referring to the same event. We can be 100% sure of this because the timing matches in both accounts. In both accounts, Jesus said it would happen in this generation. You can read this in Matthew 24, verse 34, and then Luke 21, verse 32. So it was obviously the same event. And by the way, this event actually ended up happening. According to the first century historian Josephus, Jerusalem was surrounded by armies just like Jesus said would happen in approximately the year AD 67. And by the year AD 70, the city and temple were completely destroyed. 1.1 million Jews had been killed, another 97,000 taken into slavery. The Old Covenant age had ended, again, because there was no temple anymore, just like Jesus said. So the abomination of desolation happened in the first century, just like Jesus said it would. Okay, so what does the abomination of desolation specifically refer to? There are three main possibilities that people usually bring up. The first is that it refers to the Jewish zealots who had desecrated the temple before it fell. According to Josephus, the Jewish zealots obtained possession of the Jewish temple in approximately the year AD 67 to AD 68 and made the holy place a garrison or a stronghold of their tyrannous, lawless rule, while the better priests looked on from afar and wept tears of horror. And by the way, this is from Gary DeMar's book, End Time Fiction, page 84. So proponents of this view say that the zealots were the abomination of desolation, right? They overtook the holy place and, the other priests looked on from afar in horror. So the abomination of desolation were these zealots, according to this view. Okay, the second possibility is that the abomination of desolation refers to the Roman armies who, after capturing the city in the year AD 70, they walked around the outer court of the temple with their pagan symbols lifted high. Again, this is from Gary DeMar's book, End Time Fiction, page 84. So with the temple engulfed in flames, the Roman armies offered sacrifices to their pagan gods. This was the abomination of desolation, according to proponents of this view. Okay, so that's the second view. Third possibility, which I think is the correct one, and I think it makes sense biblically, is that the abomination of desolation refers to the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day. They were the abomination that caused God to desolate or destroy the temple. As I noted earlier, Jesus called the Jewish leadership of his day everything from hypocrites to fools to blind guides to whitewashed tombs to murderers to broods of vipers. Moreover, Jesus called, by the way, that was in Matthew 23. Moreover, Jesus also called the Jewish temple, quote, a den of thieves in Matthew 21, verse 12 to 13. He also called it desolate in Matthew 23. And of course, he warned that not one stone would be left upon another in Matthew 24. And as I noted earlier, the literal definition of abomination of desolation is the abomination that causes desolation. And this fits perfectly with the Jewish leadership in Jesus' day. Their abominations, such as killing Jesus and persecuting the apostles, they didn't literally kill Jesus. The Romans did, but they pushed for Jesus' crucifixion. And you could read this in Luke 23, verse 21, and John 1:11, by the way. So anyway, their abominations, such as killing Jesus and persecuting his apostles, caused God to desolate their temple. So the Jews of that day were the abomination that caused God to desolate or destroy the temple. Okay, so that is it for today. If you like this video, please hit the like button. And if you want to be notified of new videos, hit the subscribe button. Also, for more about the topics discussed in this video, get my book, The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled. It should be out anytime now, summer 2024. Also, I put some links to some helpful articles and videos in the video notes below. One of them is called Prophecy Fulfilled. It talks about all the events that happened during this time period, during the Jewish-Roman War. So if you're interested, check that out. Or you can go to my website, thebiblefulfilled.com. I have a bunch of articles and videos about these kinds of topics that I've discussed in this video. So check that out if you're interested, okay? All right, so thanks again for watching this video. Have a great day, and I will see you next week, God willing. Have a great day.